Thank you. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you, Temba. Well, thank you, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you to the Free Market Foundation for hosting, and of course the Fraser Institute for being the major impetus behind the event today. And thank you to Jason from the Free Market Foundation for organizing. I might start off a little differently than planned by latching on to the idea of quoting communists. Because it was I think Lenin who said that another way to destroy capitalism is to debauch the currency, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about in part today. So my theme is on sound money and the Fraser Freedom Index's component, which is access to sound money. And I do it at I think an incredibly fascinating time in the history of money, not only because we can seldom find any disagreement on what is money and how money actually works, but particularly nowadays because we've seen a whole new realm of money and currency open up to us in the last 10 years or so, which is the advent of digital money, or the advent of cryptocurrency, currencies like Bitcoin. We've also seen rapid advances in banking and payments technology. In addition to the ordinary and the sort of normal complexities of a world of multiple nationalized fiat currencies, which is enough chaos to cope with, let alone all these new technological advances. It's fascinating how little agreement we seem to be able to come to around issues of money. And I must relay very briefly a story from last night's dinner, which was held a dinner between a few of the delegates here today. And the topic of money and banking came up. And I won't give you all the sort of gory details, but what was fascinating is that four free market minded gentlemen could almost agree on nothing about how banks operate, about how money is or isn't created in the banking system. And it was just a great reminder that money is not something that can easily be rationally conceived of prior the fact of market discovery, prior the fact of actual the market process. And what I want to impart to you today is that a lot of the monetary debates that we have happen within the context of centralized, monopolized, nationalized monetary systems. And so a lot of our debating about what money is really speculative. The market hasn't really been given a chance to allow us to discover what is the best form of money. And that is even true for that great old relic, the gold standard. The gold standard was indeed a centralized monetary system. Perhaps better than the one we have now, perhaps not, that's debatable, but certainly still centralized. So it's with that context that we also have to drill down to South Africa, because not only are we in a time of great technological change when it comes to money and payment systems, but we find ourselves in this country dealing with what I call the SARB wars. The South African Reserve Bank, the SARB, and the war over the control of that Reserve Bank and who gets a say in how it's run and under what institutional arrangements the Reserve Bank is run. Because, of course, the Reserve Bank is the custodian of our nationalized monetary system. And, of course, the big buzzword is around nationalization of the central bank. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the history of the South African Reserve Bank. I actually want to bring us up to a very current moment. In the last, it's not that current anymore. In 2010, so almost a decade ago, believe it or not, we had a major piece of legislative change around the way the central bank is governed. Now, I say major, perhaps it's a little bit too strong a term, but certainly the rules and regulations and the legislative requirements around governing the central bank were changed in 2010 in such a way that I believe gave far more discretion to policymakers to enact and enable monetary policy. And I think the rule of law, so to speak, governing the central bank at that time was weakened. Prior to 2010, the board, for example, of the Reserve Bank comprised of 14 people, 7 of them elected by essentially the executive branch of government, and 7 of them elected by the shareholders. This rather interesting group of people who own shares in the South African Reserve Bank, which is a legacy of many central banks because they were started very often as private charters and given monopoly privileges at the behest of their governments. So these shareholders would elect 7 board members. So 7 elected by the executive of the country, the presidency, and effectively, and 7 by the shareholders. After 2010, an additional board member was added. So we now have 15 board members on the South African Reserve Bank. 8 of them are now chosen by the executive, so a slight majority. And the 7 that are chosen by shareholders now have choice that is essentially prescribed by a panel. This is a panel that was created by the 2010 amendments to the Reserve Bank Act. And this panel constitutes about 7 votes, made up 4 votes of people chosen by the executive, again, and 3 votes by people who are elected by NEDLAC, which is essentially an executive-controlled body. So what we've seen since 2010 really is just the crimping of any shareholder influence on the central bank, to the extent that it was relevant. Now, is that a good or a bad thing? Well, people think that it's a very minor issue. To some degree, they say the shareholders didn't really matter. But this board that is constituted is quite important. The board, for example, has the authority to authorize SARB regulation, formation, ownership, control over payment, clearing, and settlement systems. So this Reserve Bank board can actually authorize the central bank to acquire shares in part or even in whole, in a sense to nationalize any kind of payment or clearing system or business entity. It can action the purchase of any company in South Africa. So you might say, when do central banks buy companies? Well, the Japanese central bank is buying companies as we speak. So is the Swiss central bank, buying Apple shares, believe it or not. So central banks around the world, through their quantitative easing policies, have moved off the old tried and tested government bonds and are now buying companies. When the central bank is wholly controlled by the government, that is an effective, slow nationalization process, very surreptitious, very under the radar form of incremental nationalization. This board on the SARB can authorize the purchases of buildings. It can action the purchase and donating of immovable property. It can authorize gratuities and other pension benefits for Reserve Bank officers or employees. There doesn't seem to be much restriction on the Reserve Bank simply hiring new officers and employees to obtain benefit from this. It gets to make rules for the good government of the bank and the conduct of its business. And it can delegate any of its powers to any officer within the central bank. So this board is actually quite important. Now, when people talk about nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank, the amendments in 2010, I think, in effect, made made almost perfect the nationalization of the Reserve Bank. So I think we're actually living already, we're 9 years into an effectively fully nationalized central bank. Now that of course doesn't mean that there are no checks and balances and legislative restrictions on the central bank, and we'll get into some of those. But it's worth going through what the Reserve Bank can actually do, what it is constitutionally and legislatively mandated to do. And the things I'm going to list to you are over and above the normal things that central banks get to do, which is to have a monopoly on the production of notes and coin, which are protected by legal tender status. It's also, and of course, it gets to conduct monetary policy, it gets to set the level of interest rates, it gets to issue new currency that it is able to print, either physically or in the form of digitized reserves within the banking system. Those are fairly universal central bank functions. What else the Reserve Bank gets to do, which I think would be shared by a number of central banks globally, it is allowed to effectively nationalize any payments system or technology. It can buy or nationalize any company, as I've already alluded to. It may even, once having purchased that company, make unsecured loans to them with approval from the board of the Reserve Bank. This information, of course, comes from the Reserve Bank Act and its various amendments. It is able to do quantitative easing, and indeed has done quantitative easing. In great number, when we were buying US short-term treasury bills between 2004 and 2011, we printed $40 billion worth of rands to purchase dollars to then purchase short-term securities. And that increased the money supply rapidly, upon which a big credit boom was sparked, which culminated in the failure of African Bank and a very, very big overhang of unsecured debt amongst households that we now sit with in this country. So we've done quantitative easing. If we decide to print money to buy South African government bonds or Eskom bonds or shares of Steinhoff, that would constitute, I think, qualitative easing as well as quantitative easing. The Reserve Bank gets to open credits and issue guarantees. Maybe someone smarter than me can tell me quite what that is, but it sounds like a very broad and unspecific mandate. It gets to pay interest to banks for excess reserves, as the Federal Reserve was permissioned to do by Congress in 2008. It gets to borrow any foreign currency from any foreign institution in any manner, terms, and interest it deems fit. And then, of course, you get the usual broad legislative stuff, like it gets to perform such other functions of bankers and financial agents as central banks customarily may perform. It gets to set reserve requirements at the governor's whole discretion. Those are the reserves that banks have to hold with the central bank. It gets to fine banks. It gets to send bankers to jail for breaking its rules. It gets to appoint people to inspect any affairs of banks. And it gets to inspect any company it suspects of being a bank. It's an incredibly broad and sweeping mandate. The finance minister is essentially the minister in the executive who is in charge of the central bank and its mandate. He gets to make regulations on, quote, any matter which is required or permitted to be prescribed by regulation under this act. And he also gets to make regulations on, quote, generally all matters which he considers it necessary or expedient to prescribe in order that the purposes of this act may be achieved. Just incredibly broad, unspecific mandates given to key individuals. The central bank wholly owns an entity called the Corporation for Public Deposits, the CPD. The CPD accepts call deposits from the public sector. However, with the permission of the Minister of Finance, the CPD may also accept call deposits from other depositors. So the CPD is already our state bank, effectively, could be a form of state bank, could at the stroke of a pen of the finance minister accept deposits from any kind of depositor, could at the discretion of the Reserve Bank get a license to operate with fractional reserves and start engaging exactly as all the banks do as a fully state-owned bank. The CPD is managed and controlled by its board of directors, who are appointed by the Minister of Finance. It's quite a powerful position, that Minister of Finance position. So why I'm painting this picture for you is because we need to understand that the Reserve Bank is often considered to be this highly independent, untouchable organization. And indeed, in the world in which you have reserve banks, that is considered best practice, that you separate the central bank from political influence, that you separate the money creation function from the whims of politicians. But really, when you scratch the surface, you find that central banks are not terribly independent at all. And that is true not only for South Africa, but for a number of major foreign central banks as well. And it's certainly true in the case of Zimbabwe and Venezuela, where the central banks just became, honeypots and money trees. You choose your metaphor. But the central bank has this incredible, to sort of repurpose a famous old phrase, it has a kind of incredible exorbitant privilege to license banks, to do all the things I've just described, to bail out banks who've made bad decisions by printing money. It's got 800 billion rands worth of gold and foreign exchange reserves. That's quite a honeypot that someone might like to raid one day. And the CPD has about 70 to 80 billion rand in assets. The Corporation for Public Deposits. That's a lot of money. That's about as big as the asset base, I believe, of Citibank, who's a foreign bank operating in this country. So there's a lot of power and influence at the center of any monetary system. Now, there's this interesting problem as we analyze this, and particularly for the purposes of the Fraser Institute's index. And that is this distinction between de jure and de facto monetary arrangements. De jure and de facto sound money or loose money. And I think this is an important little nexus of understanding here, because whilst I've just described to you a central bank in South Africa that has wide discretion to do lots of things like print lots of money, what we find de facto at the moment is that we're one of the better run and managed central banks in the world. We have one of the better run and managed monetary policies in the world. Lo and behold, we have positive real interest rates, which is to say that the rate of interest that the central bank charges commercial banks to borrow from it is in fact higher than the official rate of inflation. This is generally unheard of these days in the world of monetary policy. In fact, what we've got overseas are central banks that to some extent have gone rather rogue. They've been printing trillions of dollars and euros and yen and pounds. But not only that, they're using their means and mechanisms of what we would call financial repression to suppress interest rates below zero. In other words, I pay you to lend you money, which is rather absurd, because why wouldn't I just hold on to the cash? And of course, there's all sorts of funny incentives that governments and central banks can bring to bear on the pension fund industry and on fund managers to get them to buy bonds at negative interest rates. So currently there's something like $15 trillion worth of bonds globally that are at negative interest rates. Probably 25 trillion at negative real interest rates, which is to say that their yield is below the rate of inflation. And so we have a situation where central banks everywhere are behaving more and more in an unconstrained fashion. Now in South Africa, we have what I would call a market-constrained central bank and a politically unconstrained central bank. The politicians, if they wanted to, could hit Control P on the Saab computers tomorrow and print a lot of money. They could buy all sorts of assets. Some of the assets that they're able to buy include South African bonds, offshore government bonds, municipal and provincial bonds, state-owned enterprises bonds, commercial paper, gold, SDRs, that funny creation of the IMF. They can buy all sorts of foreign exchange. So they can really do that today. But we're a market-constrained bank, and there's a lot to be said for that. The commercial banks in South Africa, to a large degree, dictate a lot of policy to the SARB, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. But of course, certain government ministers would like to break the shackles and would like to free themselves a little bit more of these market constraints. But let's just talk very quickly about what would a market constraint look like. Well, the rand is a market constraint, for example. So if you print a lot of money and flood it into the economy, very likely scenario is that the currency is going to weaken dramatically. And that's immediately unpopular. That's immediately damaging. It's immediately inflationary. It immediately creates tremendous amount of instability, and it's highly transparent in a free floating exchange rate system. There's credibility constraints around what the central bank is doing. The fact that it is forced to a large degree to be very transparent. We do get a statement of assets and liabilities from the Reserve Bank every month. And unless there's great fraud and lying going on, we get to see on a fairly regular basis what is going on at the central bank. So there are a number of constraints. And of course, there's personnel constraints in the sense that Mr. Lesetja Kganyago, Mr. Tito Mboweni, and various other people who are custodians of the central bank do, at some important level, recognize that we can't just go and print a whole lot of money, because that does indeed tend to destroy currencies. The Ghanaian cedi, for example, lost half its value in about a 12-month period in 2013-14 by engaging in what we call quasi-fiscal policies, essentially printing your shortfall in your government finances. So you're 100 billion rand short, you just ask the central bank to conjure it up for you. Well, that immediately smacks the currency very hard, creates all sorts of instability in the banking system, and ultimately has to force interest rates up to keep up with inflation, at least, if not more, and you get a major credit crunch and all sorts of tremendous instability. So these are the kinds of market constraints. But really, from a de jure legal perspective, the Reserve Bank has an incredibly broad mandate, and more than that, provisions in the legislation to change the legislation at whim. And with a large majority in Parliament, the government would quite easily be able to do that. So with that backdrop and with a little bit of context, I just want to turn to the question of what is sound money. And I think this is a fascinating question, because I think in many respects we spend a lot of hours talking about arguably the wrong thing when we talk about sound money. Now, let me try an analogy here. Now, this is the first time I've tried this analogy, so I hope it comes off okay. If it doesn't, you'll forgive me and we'll just muddle through. But imagine we spoke of what is a sound motor car. But let's go a little further with the analogy and say that we had a monopoly in motor cars. We gave a government license to, let's just put ourselves in Germany. We gave a government license to BMW, that they would be the sole producer of motor cars. Now, they produce nice cars. They're the sole producer of motor cars. No one else may produce a motor car. The only car that may legally drive on the roads is the BMW of various models. And when the old ones get too old, you might have to change it out for a new one or so on. Now, imagine us arguing about what a sound motor car is in that world. There might be a whole lot of people conjuring up car designs in their garage, and the Mercedes guy might go, yo, I've got this great design for a car. I think it's going to be more sound, better quality, performance-wise and everything than those BMWs on the road. And then someone comes and looks at his design and says, I don't know, those BMs are pretty good. Those are pretty good vehicles. Your design looks impressive, but could it really work? And in any case, the government wouldn't let it work. And occasionally someone, the Audi guy, designs his Audi, and he actually audaciously goes and builds the thing in his garage. And you know what he does? He drives it out onto the road. No. He's quickly stopped by the police, hauled off to the side, and his car is impounded, studied for all its secrets, and potentially destroyed in an incinerator. Or maybe sent off to the BMW factory for them to copy. Now, what's fascinating is that we would spend hours, as petrol heads do anyway, debating which is the better car. Okay. But really what's going on is that we don't have a market test for what we're talking about. We can argue till we're blue in the face that Merc design or that Audi design or that VW design is better. But as long as there's a sole legal monopoly for BMW to operate, it becomes essentially an academic exercise. Academic exercises are interesting and not entirely fruitless, but what we really should care about is that there is an opportunity to test which is the soundest, best performing vehicle in the marketplace. And so what I would like to offer to you today is that sound money is not per se any kind of innate attribute of a kind of money, although post the fact I think we would see certain kinds of money predominating in the marketplace, but that's just my opinion, isn't it? So I think that what I submit to you is that sound money is not so much a specific kind of money. It's not gold, it's not the US dollar, it's not Bitcoin. It's a system of free choice in money. It's the ability to discover the best money in a market process and to evolve to better forms of money thereafter, for the market to adapt as new technologies emerge. You know, it's perfectly acceptable to say that gold was the gold standard at a time in history when, for example, we didn't have digital technology and cryptography. And we might say that gold, while a scarce and highly valuable and very often very successful financial asset, is no longer that. In the same way that BMWs might be the gold standard of vehicles at any given time, and then 10 years later not be that. And that's okay. That's how markets operate. That's how they evolve. That's how the decentralized process of trade and information dissemination and price discovery allows us to improve and to evolve. So I would say that sound money is a system of free choice in money. And as a result, I would say that the only qualification I think you need to give is the qualification that you can give to anything in the market, which is that what's on the box should be in the box. No one wants to open a box of cornflakes and pour it out and drawing pins, fall on the table. And that really is the requirement, not to defraud people, not to cheat, not to lie about what you're selling. And I would go further, but this is a tangent, that the market can actually make those regulations and can actually enforce those kinds of regulations. Nonetheless, we need a system of free choice in currency where what's on the monetary box is in the monetary box. So how do we get there? Well, I would love to say to you today that we should abolish central banks and central bank monopoly. And we, of course, should abolish legal tender laws. I mean, if the rand is so great, why hasn't it been put up to the market test? Let's test this dollar. Let's test this rand. Let's test this euro. Let's subject any kind of full reserve or fractional reserve banking to the market test. But of course, we run into a problem that I perhaps alluded to in the Q&A in the previous session, which is that there are tremendous vested interests in the system that we have. Why is it that we have monopolized, nationalized, centralized currency systems? It's a wonderful deal for those in control of it. Always has been. And so might we think of perhaps other realistic options? Now, of course, advocating for the abolition of central banks and for the abolition of legal tender laws, I think remains an important goal. And you know, what's incredible is that it used to be considered deeply radical to suggest this. And it's still considered radical, but you know, in the last 20 years, there's been an amazing awakening and awareness of what money is, how it works, and what central banks are actually doing in the world. And the rise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency has created it's actually made monetary policy, you know, punk rock, which is fascinating. It's created a whole upwelling of understanding of fiat currencies and the way governments manipulate currencies. And suddenly people are rereading, Hayek's denationalization of money and currency, and all these great texts are being revived and are being read by a young group of people that are starting to understand that it doesn't have to be the way it's always been, or the way it's been for the last 100 years, let's say, or perhaps the last 300 years, depending on your timeline for central banks. A more realistic goal might be that we look to subvert nationalized money through technology, and that's the audacious plan of things like Bitcoin. I'm not saying it's going to work, but I mean, the audacity of Bitcoin is staggering. It's the creation of a finite supply of digital units. It's the first creation of true digital scarcity that we've ever known, because most digital things have just been able to be copied. Not only that, because that's kind of common to all cryptocurrencies, but this one doesn't have a head office. Bitcoin is decentralized. As the jokes go, you know, if Congress wants to interrogate Libra, you know, they get hold of Mark Zuckerberg. They phone the Facebook office. Who do they phone if they want to interrogate Bitcoin? It's this incredible decentralized network. It's audacious. And it seems, after 10 years, to be relatively indestructible. Now, I suppose so was the Titanic, so we should choose our words cautiously. But this is the emergent discovery process that we're going through, and for less inflation. There's talk that the central bank should raise the inflation target. It should lower the inflation target. The inflation target of 3 to as much as 6% is not an inflation target. It's a guarantee that your money will lose value every year. The state has guaranteed it. We need lower inflation targets. Inflation is devastating. It devastated Zimbabwe in the most unimaginable ways. And it's created devastation in South Africa over the last 40 years. The inflation of the 80s, the inflation of the early 90s, the inflation of the early 2000s. These were very, very disruptive episodes. We should be advocating for a more competitive banking system. You know, we were discussing the mechanics of banking last night. But one of the things about commercial banking is that the less competitive it is, and at the extreme, if you had one commercial bank, it could engage in a lot of shenanigans on its balance sheet. But a competitive banking system means that banks have to keep making good with one another reserves as they flow between the banking system. So a highly competitive banking system is a very, very good thing and creates much more monetary stability. We should be advocating for a freer payment system, payment systems that are cheaper, less transparent, quite frankly. We need private payment systems. And we need to be advocating for far more constraints on central banks. The legislative leeway that the Reserve Bank has is quite remarkable and quite worrying in this political climate. So far more constraints on central banks, as we should have on governments. I mean, there seems to be no problem with writing in the Constitution that the budget shall be balanced. It's a very simple constitutional requirement. Balance the budget. Don't go into national debt. You don't get to put my grandchildren in debt, thank you very much. So these are all the kinds of constraints that we can argue for. My penultimate point would be a warning that our government has a legislative mandate and it has the control to use the Reserve Bank to radically debase our currency. There are no barriers to that as we speak. As I say, the barriers are the ones that reside in the sensibility of Lesetja Kganyago, Tito Mboweni, the market constraints around weakening your currency. But we can also say that certain ideological persuasions amongst our politicians and certain kinds of politicians would feel far less constrained than some of those that are currently running affairs in the central bank. And the point is that they really could let loose. They have the legislative mandate to do so. And of course, we had a very high-ranking government minister talking just recently about instituting quantitative easing, which would be done who knows how, because we didn't get too many details. It could be printing money to buy government bonds. It could be printing money to buy Eskom bonds, to fund Eskom. And so I leave you with a warning that the vultures are circling our central bank. Fiscal decay is a very reliable preceder of monetary corruption. Bob Mugabe's government started printing a lot of money when they got into complete fiscal calamity. The same thing happened in Venezuela. The oil price went down. The whole game was up. Everyone realized it was just Chavismo was living on a few years of oil price disbursements. The minute that collapsed, the fiscal situation collapsed, and the printing presses were fired up. And that is something that we've got to be highly vigilant of in this country. We need to talk about, we need to write about. There's various institutions represented here, and we need to be banging that drum, because when governments start down this path, it's highly addictive for them. They don't tend to easily know how to reverse it and to turn around. And I would like to end by saying this, and I think there's a little bit of positivity in this as well, and perhaps some constructive thoughts for the Fraser Institute. I think that this issue of sound money actually presents some problems for measuring indices like this. So the Fraser Institute's current approach is essentially, to simplify it, to measure inflation, to measure de facto how much inflation, what are the inflation rates that we're seeing out of a country. Now, on that basis, South Africa scores quite well, as I say, because we've got a fairly well-run central bank. So inflation in this country is running at about 4.5%. I would much prefer it at about 0%. That's a good level, I think. -1's not bad. -1's not bad. You know, bear in mind that the goal of economic progress is to make things cheaper. That is what free markets actually do. So that kind of deflation can work. It's a wonderful thing. There's some challenges for doing this. Money supply measurement. So money supply is one of the things measured by the Fraser Institute. Do you know that the official measures of South Africa's money supply given to us by the Reserve Bank measure deposits in the banking system. Now, without going on to the debate tangent, let's assume that that's the right way to measure money supply. Do you know that they exclude government deposits in banks? They exclude deposits held by foreign nationals in our banks. Why? It's money in the banking system. Just because it happens to be held by a person of another nationality, that seems like an arbitrary requirement. So you actually find these quirks of money supply measurement all over the world. Some places like Singapore, they include, rightly so, government deposits and foreigner-held deposits, but other countries don't. So I think that's an interesting nuance. It tends not to be very decisive, some of these nuances, but sometimes it can be. It also, for example, excludes money held by the government in its central bank deposits. This is actually money that's drawable immediately by the state. So that should be included too. Inflation measurement. That's a very tricky one. CPI is this big heterogeneous basket of things, and we find this average price level, but it's prone to a lot of inaccuracies. Now, I don't for a minute think that Stats SA cheat on the inflation measurement, but actually, honestly, measuring inflation is nonetheless subject to all kinds of biases on the shelf. For example, if something gets too expensive, the stores stop stocking it, and they stock cheaper things. So you can actually mismeasure inflation. The other challenge that we might face measuring indices like this is when countries do indeed start to open up de jure or de facto to other kinds of money. What happens if Libra coin starts circulating in parallel with the Rand? What is our inflation rate? Do we measure it in Rands or Libra? That becomes very tricky and very complex. So in a sense, the measurements that we get for this index are made very easy for us by the fact that we have this very centralized, nationalized currency. But if we move beyond that, it's going to start getting very tricky. And so my final thought, and I would offer this, is really to pose a question. Should a sound money index be a measure of inflation in national currency? Or should it be a measurement of the extent to which you have freedom to choose your money and your payment systems? Should it be an extent of the institutional arrangement in which people are able to interact, to trade, and to use and choose money? And I think that is something that perhaps could spark some interesting thoughts in our discussion. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that illuminated something of this topic. Thank you.
Many thanks, Russell. Very much appreciated. It gives us food for thought in preparation for that session where there will be interaction. And now we invite Fred to come up again. You need no introduction. You come to
talking while this is going on, because I think there's important points to make following the presentation. The key job of monetary policy. There are many factors you want to look at, but you don't mix them all in the same bundle and come out with a gray sheet. Instead, you look at the various colors or the various things in isolation. Otherwise, you don't know what you're talking about. So many of the things that were just mentioned are tremendously important in a number of ways, but the key job of a central bank is preserving the value of money. The alternatives are interesting. People should have an option to buy them. Maybe in X number of years they will replace money in many ways. But for now, the key thing, again, for monetary policy is preserving the value of money. In other words, preserving property. And property is the key to economic freedom. If you don't own property that has stable and reliable value that government can't fiddle with through the central bank, then your economic freedom is dramatically reduced. And yes, there are very key and very interesting problems in measuring inflation. I used to work at the Central Bank of Canada, the Bank of Canada. You wouldn't believe the brain power and analysis that goes in to try to figure out what's going on in prices. So for instance, there's the price substitution effect. People stop buying things that are more expensive relatively. So you have to readjust the basket for that. Food prices or energy prices may go up and down wildly like that. So you have to adjust for that. In fact, some of the inflation indices separate out volatile prices, food or energy. And finally, let me mention, we use measures from international institutions. This is why our data is about 2 years behind. Because what these because you're quite right, international, different statistical agencies measure different things. So what the World Bank and the IMF do is they take, the nearly 200 different statistical agencies and work through to put them on a common basis. So you're measuring apples and apples. The variation you talked about is in national statistics, not the statistics that we use. I think almost all of you were here for the presentation this morning. And I came to South Africa under a bit of a misapprehension. I thought there'd be a different group, and I think the original plan was to have different people in different groups. So my plan, as I did in Nepal, where they ran a similar setup, was in effect to talk about the advantages of economic freedom and its evidence around the world, and then hone in on the particular measures being discussed here today. But since you've all seen, or almost all of you have seen the presentation, I don't think you want a rerun. This isn't Star Wars that you might want to watch 2 or 3 times. So I'm going to avoid that. But I do want to reinforce one of the things you said, and this is hugely, hugely important. Perhaps the single most destructive economic disease a nation can face is inflation out of control. It is devastating to the economy and ultimately leads to privation, hunger, hopelessness, and perhaps even worse as a society descends into chaos. It leads to a massive exodus of citizens. The people here know about the folks fleeing from Zimbabwe. In South America, Colombia, Peru, and all the nations in the neighborhood are troubled by refugees fleeing the devastation in Venezuela. So even though, and I agree with you, the monetary policy here in South Africa now looks pretty good and pretty stable, beware. And keep your eyes on it, and if you can do anything to increase the independence of the central monetary authority, do so. Because for a politician in trouble, a quick fix is running the printing presses. Now, that's a quick fix, and the quick fix ends quickly and leads into disaster. But a politician with his or her back up against the wall might well want to do that for a respite. And there are folks all over the world who just can't understand simple lessons. In Venezuela, they thought increasing the money supply would increase the economy. Well, that's silly. They probably thought the same in Zimbabwe. Erdogan in Turkey actually believes that high interest rates cause inflation, where in fact high interest rates choke off economic growth, it's true, but also choke off inflation. So there are lots of absurd economic ideas out there to be aware of. So given that South Africa now does have a sensible monetary policy, an inflation rate of 4 or 5% is probably too high, but still, I don't have a lot to say on the way to improve things, but I do have something to say on the huge dangers you're facing, particularly if the South African economy continues to struggle. This is the quickest way and the most effective way a politician can destroy your economy. So stand on guard. And other than that, I guess we'll open it to a discussion.